Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday. This is the longer weekly update. Normally I do this live. So for those of you who are live, I'm sorry I pre-recorded this. The timing just didn't work since I'm still in Amman. But I know that Christopher from our office is with you. So it's Thursday, November 21st. Today is day 412 since October 7th of last year. Updates that are specific to today, and this is as of midday here in Jordan in the Middle East. There have been escalations. These are updates that are just since the last 24 hours, and then I'll do a summary of the last week. The attacks by Israel towards Gaza and towards Lebanon have continued to escalate. And the belief is that the strategy is if Israel shows its military prowess, that it will give it more strategic power on the negotiating table or at the negotiating table. And I'll talk more about that as it relates to Hezbollah and the conversations as the special envoy Hochstein has been here in the Middle East this past week. So just even this morning, escalations have continued in Gaza City, Beit Lahia, Jabalia in North Gaza. You know, since the Israeli closures in North Gaza over the past several weeks, there has been widespread destruction, airstrikes, heavy bombardment. In the last 24 hours, at least 2 children were killed there, multiple casualties and injuries, as residents have reported the withdrawal of Israeli forces from certain areas of Beit Lahia, particularly a housing project there and surrounding areas. The former Israeli Defense Minister Gallant has warned that the Israeli government does have a plan to establish an Israeli military regime in Gaza. He announced that today. He said that this would allow for private companies under the protection of the Israeli Defense Forces to distribute food to residents. They would be responsible for the humanitarian assistance, and then a military government would be established. He warned that this could have severe consequences, not only for life in Gaza, but also for Israel, saying that it bears human costs and that the state of Israel would suffer from mismanagement of priorities, neglect, and that this would also cause neglect to more critical security tasks. He makes the argument that if you have a military government in Gaza, it would lead to further military entrenchment. In other words, once you establish that kind of authority, it's much, much harder to withdraw without more severe security risks and consequences. So ultimately, the establishment of a permanent Israeli military regime, an occupation, a military occupation, direct occupation in Gaza would undermine the broader security interests in Israel. That's the argument of the former defense minister, Yoav Gallant. So the special envoy to the Middle East, Hochstein, was in Lebanon and then Israel this past week. Al-Akbar in Lebanon reported that the deep connection between military and political developments in Lebanon and Gaza reflect the interconnectedness between the battlefield dynamics and diplomatic negotiations. That's what I was talking about. The battlefield dynamics, Israel wants to show its prowess, that it can conquer, that it has control. And thus the escalations on the ground, and it will give Israel the diplomatic upper hand, if you will. Hochstein's been trying to negotiate a peace agreement between Hezbollah and Israel, but the issues include border demarcations, military roles. In other words, Hezbollah would be demilitarized. The Lebanese military forces would be the only military body in the state of Lebanon. And the involvement of international parties in monitoring, that would be like UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping force, and other enforcement mechanisms. Quote, Hochstein expressed optimism, which honestly, the US expressing optimism in terms of peace agreements or anything at this point, that coming from any Biden administration official, this many months in, when the Biden administration has so little credibility at this point, to me, means less or little to nothing. But the challenges that remain, according to analysis are disputes over the borders, dismantling Hezbollah's infrastructure, their militarization, specifically south of the Litani River, and ensuring mutual security guarantees. So to me, that still sounds like a lot, but I'll continue to give the updates. So that's kind of where things stand. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's aide, Ron Dermer, told Trump this week that Israel is rushing to advance a ceasefire deal in Lebanon as a gift to the president-elect. Now, I heard when Ron Dermer briefed President-elect Trump that Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was also present, seemingly indicating that Kushner will be involved in Middle East negotiations and political activities in the next administration. All the while, Israel has escalated its military actions, aiming to leverage the battlefield outcomes. That's what I've been talking about. Now, I've heard Palestinian human rights lawyer Christian Jonathan Kattab, he always says, how can one negotiate when your opponent has their foot on your throat and you can't breathe? He says that all the time. But reports suggest ongoing legal and technical consultations on phrasing and guarantees with both sides, anticipating a possible resolution soon. So we shall see, as they say in Arabic, Insha'Allah, God willing, or may it be so. If an agreement comes to pass, the Lebanese army would head south to fill security gaps, and would be deployed per the terms of the agreement. News reports say, while Hochstein's optimism is notable, the complexities surrounding the border demarcations and the security provisions underscore the fragility of the process. There's a draft agreement that's being considered between Hezbollah and Israel. It includes a 60-day truce, and if a ceasefire were not obtained and further agreements were not agreed to, fighting could resume with both domestic, Israeli, and American approval after 60 days. The death toll in Lebanon since October of last year is now 3,558 killed, more than 15,000 wounded. On Tuesday of this past week, just to give you, an update on that particular day, 14 people were killed and 87 wounded. In terms of updates on Hamas negotiations, there continue to be efforts to advance those discussions. Hamas claims they have flexibility. Egypt has proposed a return to the idea of a 2 to 3 day temporary ceasefire. They've also proposed an administrative committee for Gaza that would manage affairs. This is an alternative to what we heard about in terms of a military control by Israel. Egypt proposed an agreement for policing that would be led by a national figure in full coordination with the PA and Egypt. They said, quote, the occupation protects thieves and criminals, facilitating the theft of aid with its approval. I mean, I've not seen any response from Israel to proposal. I would presume it's a non-starter. Aid distribution this week, 8 Jordanian helicopters with aid were unloaded at the Gaza Strip border yesterday. On Wednesday, they were brought through a border opening called the Karni border crossing that was opened between 1994 and 2011 for export and import using a back-to-back transfer method previously of Palestinian products. So that's a new border crossing we have not heard a lot about. It's called the Karni crossing. 2 journalists in the last 24 hours, Mahmoud Al-Khatib and Abdul Rahim Al-Tarari, were killed. An additional journalist was arrested around an Israeli bombardment in Gaza City. A 22-year-old Israeli soldier from Jerusalem was killed in South Lebanon overnight. And the big news related to the U.S. was that the U.S. has defended their veto, the only veto of a ceasefire resolution related to a ceasefire agreement around Gaza. They did so saying that they were protecting remaining American hostages and that they would not turn their back on them, hostages that have remained in Gaza for the past 13, 14 months. After 2 days of Israeli incursions in Jenin, reports have indicated that 8 Palestinians have been killed, leaving large-scale destruction and infrastructure behind in the community. And more than 66 people have been killed by an Israeli bombing of a residential block near the Kamal Adwan Hospital in North Gaza. This area has been blocked off from civil authorities since about a month. Just recall the global incident I believe it was a soccer field in Ukraine where, several dozen people were killed in recent months. And there was a global outcry. I mean, global outcry. This is happening every single day in Gaza, and we're not talking about it anymore. And it continues to go on day after day after day. Sunday's death toll was more than 70 people. Monday's death toll was 100. The death toll in the last 24 hours has been more than 100 people. The death tolls as of the 19th of November were 43,972 people killed in Gaza, at least. And most experts say that these numbers are minimal compared to what the numbers actually are. Those injured, more than 100,000. That means that the numbers now are over 44,000. You'll start to see that reported widely in the news. More than 44,000 people. That's just a brief summary of what's happened in the last 24 hours or so. Other major news from this past week, and I apologize, my daily updates are getting to be, less than 15 minutes. I'm trying to keep them less than 10. I said, because things have been escalating in Lebanon, there's been so many things happening. I'm doing about 7 minutes on Gaza, 7 minutes on Lebanon. So I'm keeping them at less than 10 minutes, but the escalations have been expanding. And so it's hard to give a summary. So I apologize. I'm not trying to be so verbose, because I know that people much prefer snidbits, but snapshots and things like that. Other major happenings this past week, in terms of Israel, an Israeli soldier was killed yesterday as well. The number of deaths of Israeli soldiers has just surpassed 800. The number 800 soldiers or officers killed since last October. That was announced on the Israeli Army radio this week. The 800th soldier was killed in Beit Lahia in clashes in Gaza. Most of these soldiers are kids. They're in their teens, their late teens, their early 20s. Not only is Gaza scarred, but the next generation of young men and women in Israel are scarred as well. And I'm not making a comparative analysis. And I know that there is individual trauma, and there's corporate trauma, and there's systemic injustice, and it has to be addressed. But this is a scar on humanity, and a scar on Israel, and a scar on Gaza, and the injustices and the oppression and the occupation. I think I mentioned I was speaking to an Israeli lawyer this week, and he said, the atrocities of October 7th are abhorrent, and he loves Israel. He's an Israeli, and but he said the occupation is the cause, and he said it is the root that is destroying the democracy, or any remaining democracy in Israel. A kindergarten in Acre, or called Akko, along the Mediterranean coast of Israel, was hit by a rocket from Hezbollah this week. There were no injuries, but today in Acre, the schools are closed because of the aftermath. Israel has issued more than 1,000 arrest warrants for ultra-Orthodox conscripts who've not responded to drafting orders. I saw a video of an Orthodox young man this week who said, I will not serve in this army because I won't go to war to kill. And so that's a major issue within Israeli society also. On Monday this week, there was an Israeli woman, Safa Awad, a Palestinian Muslim citizen of Israel, a 50-year-old teacher and mother of 4. She was killed by a rocket attack by Hezbollah in Haifa. 10 other people were wounded, including a 4-year-old boy. These are updates from Israel this past week. Prime Minister Netanyahu's aide allegedly leaked classified information to foreign press in a bid to influence public opinion on hostage negotiations. And during a visit to Gaza this week, Prime Minister Netanyahu offered a $5 million reward and promise of safe passage out of the territory to anyone who returns a captive, someone held hostage in Gaza. Settler leader Daniela Weiss told Israel's Channel 13 News that she took a field tour of the Netzarim quarter in North Gaza, where she plans to establish Jewish settlements. When asked how she would respond because Netanyahu opposes resettlement of the Strip, she said she's not worried. If it's unrealistic, we'll make it realistic, she said. In Gaza, Human Rights Watch report came out this week saying that the IDF has forced nearly 90% of all of the residents of the Strip, that's about 1.9 million people, to evacuate from their homes, often more than once. And there's no plausible imperative military reason to justify such mass displacement. The report said such acts constitute crimes against humanity. This week had World Children's Day, and we turned our eyes to Gaza, where the reported death toll of children is at least 17,400 children killed. Over the past year, UNICEF said that more than 200 children have been killed in the past 2 months and 1,100 children wounded in Lebanon in the past 2 months. 200 children killed in Lebanon over the last 2 months. The Gaza update in many ways over the past week has remained the same. Death, 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 death. 32 killed in raids in the Gaza Strip since dawn on the 20th, 19 in the North Gaza Strip. On Wednesday night, 6 people were killed sheltering in Khaled bin al-Walid school in the Nusrat refugee camp. On Tuesday, the IDF committed 2 mass killings in the last 24 hours where at least 30 people were killed. Also on Tuesday, several people were injured due to ongoing artillery shelling of the Al-Barej camp and west of the Al-Nusrat camp. An infant from the Abu Warda family was killed following artillery shelling at a camp west of Al-Nusrat. I could go on and on and on and on. We could talk about the humanitarian crisis that remains there as well. A UN aid envoy of 109 trucks of food supplies was looted on Saturday. That was widely reported in international news. The UN said it is the obligation of Israeli authorities to facilitate the safe delivery of aid. Organized gangs have been stealing Gaza aid supplies and operating freely in areas controlled by the Israeli military. An internal UN memo concluded that the gangs may be benefiting from the passive, if not active, benevolence or protection of the IDF. Relief organizations have accused Israel of enabling theft and attacks on aid convoys, contradicting claims about Hamas interference in humanitarian aid efforts. Finance Minister Smotrich told Army Radio that the supply of aid in Gaza and the lack of IDF control over its distribution are bigger failures than October 7th. He then requested to go back on the air, clarifying that he did not intend to make that comparison. The Egyptians have called for the reconsideration of a 2 to 3 day humanitarian truce between Gaza and Israel, but Israel has continued to reject that idea. Many are saying that's too little, too late. And the Israeli Supreme Court had deliberations this week about 2 men from Gaza who were arrested and died while in detention. Israel has acknowledged that at least 36 Palestinians have died while in prison in Israel over the past year. If you're interested in more about that, you should listen to my report from Wednesday. Dozens of massed settlers, now moving on to the West Bank, entered the village of Beit Farik, east of Nablus, and caused significant damage to property, according to the IDF. Security sources said that they are suspected of having originated from the settlement of Itmar and setting fire to homes and a car in the nearby village. And I've talked about the incursions and hostilities in Jenin in the north of the occupied West Bank that lasted for several days. They resulted in 8 deaths and much destruction this past week. 2 cars were set on fire in the Palestinian village of Al-Mazara Al-Arabiya in the northern West Bank. It was believed to have been by settlers. You'll recall, I believe I shared this with you, that when I was in Jerusalem last week, there were 5 cars set on fire just about a block away from the St. George's Guest House on Nablus Road in East Jerusalem, in the Shakhrah neighborhood. 1 car exploded in the middle of the night, and I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it sounded like a bomb had exploded, which was quite a scary experience. Yesh Din, the Israeli human rights organization, documented 114 incidents of violence by settlers and armed soldiers against Palestinians during the olive harvest in October, an average of more than 3 incidents per day. Moving on to Lebanon, residents of South Lebanon say there's nowhere safe anymore after Israeli strikes have continued to be launched against residential buildings or houses hosting displaced people in South Lebanon. And the bombings and attacks in Lebanon have been reported by people there that it's worse than during the 2006 war that displaced more than 1 million people. The bombing of Lebanon's been so severe that it's triggered false earthquake alerts in northern Israel, according to news articles from last month. And this week, Sheikh Naim Qassim, who's the new head of Hezbollah, gave a speech that was aired on Wednesday, just after the departure of U.S. Special Envoy Hochstein, who's been there to talk about potential peace proposal between Hezbollah and Israel. Qassim said, "We won't surrender until a ceasefire is achieved with respect for Lebanon's sovereignty." On Wednesday, an Israeli attack on Syria's historic city of Palmyra killed 36 people. This is not in relation to Lebanon. This is in Syria. 36 people. That death toll has now increased to more than 50. And today it was reported the death toll is now at 61 people. And that's following last week's attack that was reported on the 14th of November of Israeli strikes on Damascus, Syria, that killed at least 15 people and injured more than a dozen others. Netanyahu claimed that Israel's strike on Iran took out a nuclear program or nuclear capabilities. But this week, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency said there's no indication that the Parchin military complex that Israel hit in Iran in the air attack last month was a nuclear facility or that it had any nuclear material present. Senior Hamas negotiators are no longer in Doha, Qatari officials said, and Turkey made clear that they corrected the reports about that were indicating that Hamas was moving their offices to Turkey. They said that's incorrect. So we don't know where Hamas is reestablishing their headquarters. Iran's president, Pezeshkian, called on Pope Francis to use his influence with Christian governments to stop the war in the Middle East. And His Holiness Pope Francis called for an investigation about whether or not what's happening in Gaza might be a genocide. In a book that's said to come out next year, this was heavily criticized by a conference of European rabbis who said that His Holiness was insinuating that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. In the US, the biggest news, of course, was this UN veto about the ceasefire resolution. Also, Iran's news agency reported that Tehran categorically denied having met they denied that their UN envoy met with Elon Musk in New York. They said that did not happen. Musk, of course, is said to be an advisor for the US President-elect Trump. And a group of 20 White House staffers criticized the Biden administration for failing to follow through on Gaza's aid demands in a letter that was seen by Politico. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Israel's Amana settler organization this week, as well as 2 other groups and 3 individual Israeli settlers, the Treasury Department said this week. This is a key part of the Israeli extremist settler movement. Amana maintains ties to various persons previously sanctioned by the U.S. government and are responsible for perpetuating violence in the West Bank. Also, Congress voted this week on Bernie Sanders' joint resolutions of disapproval aimed at blocking some arms sales to Israel. That was in the Senate. As expected, the JRDs failed. The joint resolutions of disapproval, some of them were voted on. One did receive 19 votes in support. This was not quite half of the Democratic caucus, but it is still quite significant. Also significant is the shifting positions of a number of prominent Jewish groups, including 2 that have been viewed as quite moderate, both after October 7th of last year supported Israel's right to defend itself. In other words, they supported the war on Gaza. The U.S. Human rights group of prominent rabbis in the U.S. is called Trua. The other is J Street, a lobbying agency that considers itself pro-Israel. They're both now calling for the withholding of some arms from the state of Israel. Rabbi Jill Jacobs, Trua's chief executive, told religious news services, offensive weapons are keeping the war going, causing horrific damage to Palestinians. It's not keeping Israelis safe, certainly not getting the hostages back. One piece of U.S. law that countries can't block humanitarian aid. There should not be double standards for Israel. That was Jill Jacobs of Trua. J Street, the Jewish lobbying group, is also calling for the withholding of certain weapons from Israel. Both of these groups were initially in support of Israel's right to defend itself. They're now calling for the withholding of some weapons, which is hugely significant. So that is the daily or weekly summary for Thursday, November 21st, day 412. So thanks for joining us this week, and continue to pray and work together. There's so much to do, and I hope you'll join us in our Advent campaign, Advent, Not Arms. May God continue to go before us in the name of Christ. Amen.